as we were setting up the altar, I was listening to the experience that you had had in Corfu, and it hit me by the expression used, which summed it all up, that you two had had that experience of being enclosed in mystery. To quote, one is in a wee world of one's own. That is, for the duration of the ancient Eastern liturgy. But that actually, in its own quaint way, says more than we think. It's not more of the same thing. It's another world, and one has time to be in it, isolated, and therefore, and this is the big bit, workable upon. One is available unto him that we are trying to approach. Compare that with a situation where, from the moment one comes into church to the moment one goes out, the mind has been drained by contact or attention given unto basically the human. One goes in and one is obliged to talk. One enters the mode of liturgy and one comes into noise. One comes into a homily and one hears about Gaelic football. One comes to communion and it is not quickly enough done in such a way that one can get to the important bit, the church notices, even before the post-communion prayer. And then at the end, to appreciate what has been done, the performance, a great round of applause is given to those who have performed. For who? Question mark. Who has been served? And then, as soon as the blessing has been given, we have, of course, a huge outburst of yet more noise. Now, if you think I'm exaggerating, look around. Is it or is it not true that actually corresponds fairly closely to the average Sunday fare? And if one looks also at the way in which by about 35 to 40 minutes people are always in a hurry to get out, to get to more important things, often carrying in themselves the Lord of Hosts that they have tried to encounter, then one sees what meagre fruit is probably perceived on the level of this Catholic land, compared with what perhaps would have happened only 50 years ago, certainly 60, 70 years ago, when perhaps fewer people went to Holy Communion, but at which at least everyone was aware of what they were doing. Spiritual communion, that's gone out of the window, in favour of a free-for-all. Made easier now by precisely this element of which the first reading speaks, that element of not distinguishing the body, of which Pope Benedict actually wrote when warning in about 2005 in Sacramentum Caritatis that this was not to happen, that there was a problem on the level of Catholic comportment at the sacred mysteries, that massively there was no discerning of the body in large assemblies where everyone went to receive Holy Communion, not aware precisely that this could lead to the situation of which St. Paul is speaking, facing the consequences. Because St. Paul actually has very clear language about the consequences of receiving the body and blood of the Lord unworthily. He even goes as far as to say that it's the reason for the early death, what he calls the falling asleep of many. It's actually quite startling. That is the first generation of Christians, and it was already a problem. What now, when in this post-Christian society, because of funerals, weddings, and social occasions, there is a massive onslaught towards the altar? Now, I mention this because, as I said, it happens that you've had this experience of the Eastern liturgy, but it's not actually the same as regards its notion of approach. The essence is the same because the presence is the same. The sacrifice is the same there where there is the priesthood and they have the priesthood. But the approach is by no means the same. You will have noticed that very few receive Holy Communion, for instance. Usually a few babies in the arms of their mother, because they're innocent. Okay, they haven't developed the sacramental discipline and life that we have. But I would propose this to you and ask you to take it away with you. Remember also where we have come from. In the high Mass, specifically the Missa Cantata with incense, we do have something of that. It's longer, it's at least an hour normally. And also the suggestion is there, especially when we maintain the old rite, because that is the point of encounter in language, mode and ethos with the East. If you noticed what happened, at least in Ireland, in the years following the Council, essentially, bit by bit, what happened in the long term was this. The high just went out of the window and we were left always with the low. Every celebration practically is a low Mass with a few hymns thrown in. Now, people aren't aware of the difference, but there's a huge difference. It's also damaged by the fact that priests have many celebrations to assure. If they're going from one celebration to the other, they get actually used to it. And they're aware of time passing, so as not to be late for the next celebration, perhaps in a second or third church. It's all leading to a functionalism, a notion of automatism, of, yes, loss of awareness, and if we're not careful, even loss of faith, because also that has come in. Several practices have added to, by now, the lack of transmission of faith in the real presence. If you ask little children what is actually happening, even at the moment of their first communion, one will get an ambiguous answer quite often. And why? Because the whole of the education, not just the verbal bit, but the whole of it is contrary to our faith. A child who sees objectively, habitually, granny, auntie, whoever it might be, dressed in normal clothes, handing out what is talked about as the holy bread, and then perceives that everyone receives casually in the hand as they would ordinary bread, that message is a total message, which leads, yes, to actually a loss of faith and awareness, therefore not discerning the body. And one sees it in the way that children behave and carry away lightly the bread of angels. Now compare that with your experience, some of you at least, when you were children at your first communion. Was it that, or was it something very different? This is not just human. The demon hates, with a perfect hate, the Blessed Sacrament. And so he's going to attack it. And this is what we're up against. There is a massive attack. I remember some years ago making a short retreat with a holy priest in Venice. He was actually the son of a prince, Prince Rupert. He was this noble Englishman, von Löwenstein, and he was calm and almost mystical in his way of celebration. And in the sacristy, he just said one thing to me which hit me. He just calmly said to me, I cannot share your views with regard to willing to participate and celebrate the new way of doing things. He didn't go into detail, but he did say this. There has been a huge attack on the sacred, and this cannot be pleasing to our Lord. He left it at that, but it hit me, especially after seeing his way of approaching it and the amount of time he spent in Thanksgiving. It hit me. Perhaps the Lord brought me to that little retreat for a reason. Never get used to the Holy of Holies. When ordained, I was allowed to go back to celebrate my first Masses here and also in Wales, and actually the first one of all on British territory was in Prinnich Abbey when I got back. And I was given the old things that we're wearing here, and it was in a little chapel facing the other way, and it was very beautiful. And the novice master, who was by then about 90, but whom I'd known when in school, served it. It was in Latin, and he just made one remark after we got back into the sacristy. Never lose your father. And I've always remembered that. It's something that one sometimes sees in a sacristy. O priest of God, celebrate this Mass as though it were your first Mass. Celebrate it as though it were your last Mass. Celebrate it as though it were your only Mass. And so it should be. And therefore this notion of running from one altar to the other is actually extremely damaging. Let us ask for the grace in this votive Mass of the Blessed Sacrament never ever to get used to our God, but to somehow receive something of the notion of total otherness, time and space, majesty and glory, which uncontaminated our brethren in the East still have.